Welcome back to Trending in Education. Dan Strafford, Michael Palmer, and Brandon Jones with us. Today we're talking about trends in education. Surprising, I know, with the title of the show, but mega trends into the future, and also talking a bit about 2020. Mike, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. Like I feel like I've been setting up for this the last 3 years. Like it's like there's, you set them up and then you knock them down. So for 3 years, and I'll include the three of us. Brandon, welcome to the show. Brandon Jones, esteemed colleague, always a pleasure to have you. We started this whole trending in education thing 3+ years ago, but you do that every week for 3 years, try to figure out what's emerging, what's accelerating into the future, what's on the horizon. You get better at it, and then everybody's kind of catching up to that mindset now, because I think everybody's on the horizon of the 2020s, and everybody's trying to understand what's it going to be like for the next 10 years, because I think everyone's sensing that change is coming. And in some ways, I think there's a little bit of refresh that people want to kind of put the 20th century fully in our rearview mirror and actually be able to lean into living in the future. But I think it's going to take a lot of good thinking to figure out how do we navigate the future. And then a lot of that begins, I think, by trying to understand like what's right on the horizon. So I think that's why we were bringing Brandon back and kind of going to our old playbook a bit with Brandon, just to figure out what does Brandon see on the horizon in the year ahead, and then I think we're going to continue to have these types of conversations, whether it's just the year ahead or the next 10 years, because that's the thing that's really been capturing my imagination lately, is like by 2030, that time horizon is super interesting, and we haven't really done that so much. Like we generally have been more within a year or two in terms of the timing. So I think we'll continue to cycle in on this stuff. But yeah, Brandon, welcome to the show. We definitely want to get your hot takes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to be here. I will echo your sentiments here, Mike, that this is always an interesting time of year. Sort of you come to the end of the year, reflecting and preflecting on what's to come, and then 10x so at the end of a decade, right? So we have these somewhat arbitrary demarcations in life of what is today versus tomorrow versus next year, and yet we as humans with sort of actuarially speaking sense of how long we're going to live, a decade is a meaningful thing, right? And so maybe it be becoming less so in the future where humans are living much longer. But for us, people born in the 20th century, a decade is a material measure. We do censuses.
Sensei. Yes.
Every decade.
Yes.
There are when you think back, people talk about the 20s and 30s and 40s. They don't in many cases talk about the 4-year period from 1953 to 1957, right? There's like,
right.
It is a good way to measure a meaningful enough chunk and
yes.
of human history. And so I think that's right. And I look forward to continue to jam with the two of you and others as we talk about what's on the horizon for the next 10 years.
Yeah. And, interestingly, the 20-year chunk, it's a score, but people don't talk about, you don't talk about the score that is finishing, but like we're settling the first score of the 21st century. There, I got it.
So good.
In the next year or so. So like, we'll be like finalized. It's like the bottom of the ninth for the
so
first
good. It
score,
keeps on being good.
So Dan, because we do this all the time.
Right.
We don't have our specific predictions prepared as of yet, but I believe Brandon has. I mean, we could wing it a little, but I think we want to build a little suspense around those things. Will be revealed in due time. But Brandon,
yes,
I believe you are ready to bring some ideas around what you're anticipating. Is it in the year ahead? Like what time horizon are you ready to talk about?
Yeah, so I would say, yes, and you here. Yes, these I've got a couple of things that are on my mind for
Yeah.
2020,
Yeah.
and then I'd love to jam with you again on a little longer time horizon. But I'll do the foreshortened version of what's coming up in the near future, and
Yeah.
keep it 2020.
Yeah. And just one thing here. So we've talked about when we want to keep it 2020, right? We want to have our 2020 vision, right? But sometimes it makes sense to be farsighted, in which case you got to keep it 2030. All right. So I just wanted to put that out there, and now I'm going to get out of the way. So yeah, please.
I think we have a new T-shirt to make there. That's well done. Brandon, what's on your mind?
I would say these jokes write themselves, but it's really Mike that writes them. So, so as we look ahead to 2020, I'll start with a pretty unfresh prediction, which is 2020 is an every 4-year year. So that will be an election year. And election headlines are going to dominate everything. And I say that sort of woefully. It's not something I'm looking forward to. I like I exercise my civic responsibility and I lean into this process. So I'm not, I don't wish for a very different system. I wish that the sort of tenor of the conversation were different right now. From an education point of view, this is an education podcast. So, the items that are on the list for 2020, you'll probably hear on debate stages, et cetera, include free college education for all or in some format, whether that's free community college, free 4-year college, dramatically reduced cost burden for college. I'm interested in that. I hope that that does pique some interest because I think that educational attainment, although I do think that for a farsighted forecast here, 2030, there's going to need to be more material change in our higher education system.
Tuition's too damn high.
That's good.
Tuition is too damn high.
That's right. For folks who don't know, the rent is too damn high guy from New York City, go check him out. You can Google that. But yeah, it's I think for 2020, I can pretty confidently say that there will not be major changes in the higher education system. So things like free community college or college fall are important. And the second is debt forgiveness of student loans. So, this is one where doesn't really matter where you are on the political spectrum is you're going to have a point of view on it. And I don't know that there is one point of view that is necessarily more right than another, but it is a real burden. And I think does, demands a healthy conversation about what we do about that. And those two things are linked for future students, but for the students who have gone through and, thinking about 2020, we have students who are bearing student loan debt and who are in college who were born in the 21st century.
Right.
And for the 2020 election, this is the first time that people born in the 21st century will be voting for a president in the United States of America.
Right.
So, that is the demographic change, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But the demographic changes, they're happening, whether or not you see them, they are happening. So my last point on the 2020 election is I'm activated by the education related items. I am despondent is probably too uncharitable, but I'm doubtful that those will bubble up. I think that the 2020 election is going to be about electability and sort of fit for the office of presidency. We're going to be hearing.
Plus the impeachment, like whatever's going to be unfolding in the next few weeks. I mean, like it's almost like we're going to go through some ordeals even before the election happens,
Yeah.
So like, but like these topics are spot on, like they'll be bubbling up, but like we are in the midst of a constitutional crisis. So like the likelihood that like educational policy is transformed, hopefully maybe we could help focus the conversation, get more, like the topics you're raising, also like, affirmative action in higher ed is another interesting one that I think is going to have a lot of attention, probably even at the Supreme Court. There will be place where education is bubbling up, but it's going to be tough to really make an impact amidst the noise.
I think that's right. Good luck navigating your way through the noise to all of those. And by that noise, I don't mean the dulcet tunes of the three of our voices. I mean the noise that's going to be around you, 2020 election style. That's one of three. I've got two more. So the second is it's a callback to an old favorite of mine, but 5 words for you. Those 5 words are Greta Tintin Eleanor Ernman Thunberg.
Yeah.
So she is the youngest. This is the climate activist, 16-year-old climate activist from Sweden.
Yeah.
You've probably seen
bringing pigtails back.
Absolutely. So she has most recently been named, as we close out this decade, Time's youngest ever person of the year. Which is incredible and speaks to, again, the trend we've talked about a couple times here of kid solving. I'll come back to that in a second. I think there are a couple things that are interesting about her story. One is her age, not to be too reductive, but she's 16. So she is a 21st century child. She has gotten onto a world stage, quite literally, having briefed the United Nations as a 16-year-old political activist and her principal concern is around climate change. And the rhetoric of that conversation and some, including some elected officials, have just dismissed it. But the rhetoric there is to get attention of the adults in the room. She has talked about how adults are stealing her future. And I do think that is a theme that will continue to develop, is a generational tension. You can see this in OK Boomer. You can see this a lot of places, but generational tension between children who are increasingly empowered and increasingly have platforms through social media, et cetera, to demand change from the people who hold economic power and who are adults. So I think that the tension there is going to continue to be on display. And I for one, I'm hashtag Team Greta. I think that we should do more in listening to the children with powerful voices around us.
Yeah, that one's super interesting too, just in terms of the political power that's available to someone prior to being able to vote is really just speech, speech and the right to assemble. And like, that's the thing that is really interesting to me, is how the younger, and then beyond that, there's holding elected office. And if you look at how old the Senate is skewing in particular in the US, it's like, people in their late 60s and 70s is probably like the average age of a U.S. senator, for the rising generations to feel like they can actually impact the political world. It's not really going to be through traditional democracy. It's more through the right to assemble, the right to mobilize. So I do think that you're definitely hitting on something. And I think Greta is hitting on that thing, which I think you had talked about as kid solving back in the day. And I also think it's more intergenerational and complex too, like around the relationships too, because like I particularly the boomers aging out is the thing that I think is really resonating. And then how divided, because basically there's 2 or 3 generations in the middle between like Greta and a U.S. senator, for example, and like the majority of the country is in the middle there, but we're sort of watching that conversation happen. And what I'm interested is to see how it becomes more multiple voices with different perspectives that aren't only sort of understood, only indexed against age. Because I think sometimes that can be limiting as well. Greta should be a wonderful guest too. So we should explore
Dan, you've got an assignment for you there.
Yeah.
2 last things on Greta before I wrap with my third. So one is, Mike, you've talked about this author, the author of *Sapiens*. You all know Harari in the past. One of, I think it was probably from last year, but an article that he wrote, or a synthesis of something that he had written, talked about how 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, 200 years ago, it made sense to trust adults because adults had good connection to sort of from an actuarial point of view, from a predictable point of view, what the world was going to look like when their children grew up. And that's no longer the case. So, if this is reductive, but the idea that children should be trusting adults to give them life advice, that's maybe more tenuous than it's been. And so this is, again, just in the sort of Greta space.
Especially if it involves programming a VCR, right? I mean, like, they just should not trust them anymore.
That's right.
I'm sorry. I got that. I mean, I'm in a DVD player. Sorry. Excuse me.
And then the last item on Greta, and this is maybe a segue into the next, is she has, and her mom has opened up about her Asperger's, and Greta talks about that as her superpower. And I think sort of bridging from there to the third, and disclosure, I work for a behavioral mental health company that does exam preparation, continuing education. So this is going to sound a little bit like a shill, and I'm not intending it to, but I do think that behavioral mental health is for 2020 even, and then maybe if I can plug that for your broader 10 trends for the next 10 years, Mike, like that is going to become increasingly important. And I think Greta is actually a good example, again, to segue here, where, someone is turning what is a condition that yields a lot of social anxiety, turning that into a superpower. I like the language around that. And so early diagnosis, early treatment, the right kind of care, behavioral analysis, some of the whole person movement, when the whole patient movement, we talked about the whole student movement, the whole teacher movement. Talking to a pediatrician the other day, and he was talking about he's a proponent of sort of holistic medicine and a whole patient movement, that typically there are two outcomes for patients in healthcare systems today. It's either pharmacological or surgical, and really that there should be a third set of outcomes, which today is just sort of a bridge to one of those other two. I do think that behavioral health and that can sort of sweep up things like the quantified self, starting to get attuned to your self and not just your physical state, but also your mental state is going to be really important.
You get social and emotional about it, right?
Absolutely. And then the last point on this, and this is going to be increasingly so over the future, is the demographic shifts are really important. And when you think about mental health care, for example, the way that care is going to be preferred to be consumed and preferred to be delivered is changing. It is no longer a feature to have someone show up to a building with four walls and sit on a leather couch. That is not a feature. More of that is going to be delivered through telehealth, more on your phone. And I think that's really important. If you can there's all this study that shows if you can get to people in crisis, in those moments of crisis, you can avert even more serious crises. So, I hope, I guess I started off a little bleak as I talked about 2020 election and what's going to be coming in our news feed. I guess this one is more aspirational, which is, if we can remove the taboo around talking about mental health, if we can provide both assessment and care for people who need it, I think we're people that live on the inside as much as the outside, and so we gotta be thoughtful about who we are, who the world is, in all those ways.
Yeah, makes sense. And I mean, we've talked a little bit about neurodiversity too, that, groups that include people on the Asperger's syndrome, folks with ADHD, or, on whichever spectrum you look at, generally that diversity is going to add to a culture, help you understand different options, make better decisions, which is really awesome. And then at the same time, I think thinking more about how mental health and behavioral health ties to the self-care, self-improvement movement, and how a lot of it is already, I think the stigma is already starting to disappear, particularly through like mindfulness and the sort of behavioral practices that are leading to less loneliness, really sort of averting some of the behavioral problems that I think are emerging around social media without good behavioral health planning and good design thinking around how to sort of fix what's broken about humanity. I think we're in a lot of trouble, but I'm very hopeful that sort of collective awareness, that the zeitgeist is starting to pivot in the direction you're heading, which also hopefully bodes well for you professionally too. So good on that. Dan, any time for rebuttal or follow up? Do you want to cede any of your time? Any concluding remarks from my esteemed colleague from the Boston area?
Mr. Speaker, I will keep my time and quickly say I think it's also indicative of how learning's going. One-to-one learning, digital learning, and the like there I think is going to go hand in hand with what Brandon's talking about from a social, emotional, and from a therapy perspective. We're going to see more people reaching out to individuals to teach them things on a one-to-one basis as we move forward. So a great segment. Brandon, we'll have you back very soon. Mike and I will continue the conversation after this. Back here with Mike, Dan Strafford, talking about some predictions for 2020. We just heard Brandon Jones, former co-host and a guest here on the show regularly, some of his predictions. He talked a little bit about teletherapy, Mike, which we've talked about pretty exclusively, not extensively is the right word there, on the show. But as I said to Brandon, it really speaks to me the idea of technology and learning, right? That we're just growing the one-to-one, the peer-to-peer, the live online aspect of learning. And though MOOCs may have been killed off a few years back, it's just going to keep growing and keep becoming part of the fabric of learning. Do you agree with that?
I think so. Although I guess so. Yeah. I mean, the MOOCs, I would distinguish MOOCs from like behavioral health, just generally that. And also I wouldn't necessarily count MOOCs out. Like, I think lots of times they maybe miss the mark in terms of their early hype, and they're still part of the world we live in, and the language is just going to evolve. So I actually thought it was an interesting decade to think about MOOCs, but that's more looking backwards. Looking ahead, I think behavioral health is an interesting concept, and full disclosure, that's where Brandon is now working at a behavioral health company, Triad Behavioral Health. We also talked to Russell Glass at Ginger and Kate Everly Walker at Presence Learning. Not to mention, we've been tracking some of the social isolation and social pressures that particularly the rising generations are facing in this day and age, in many ways driven by screens and use of those types of things. So I think behavioral health obviously is going to be big in the next year. And getting back to the point that I think we're going to be shifting into is like, we actually want to understand both 2020, but also start looking towards 2030. So like, what do the next 10 years look like? Because if you can plan with that type of strategic horizon, frequently you can unlock potential now if you think about what might be a favorable outcome 10 years from now. So like, trying to be farsighted in our perspective there, I think will be really useful. And I'd love to get more voices in on the, just trying to imagine what's coming, and understand that we all see it from our own perspective, which is obviously going to have its own biases as well. I think the more we can get people thinking about what's coming, the more likely people will start to get creative about getting to new places. And that's the other thing. It's like all the research I've read has said it's important to think about multiple outcomes. Like don't over-index on one scenario. Even if you think your prediction is perfect, you're going to be wrong in some surprising ways, because life is surprising. And just be flexible and adaptable. So it's that. Strong opinions lightly held, I think, is the language that I got from Colonel Chris Mayer when we were talking about VUCA and strategic thinking. I kind of like that, the idea that, clarity of vision, but flexibility of action, so like you get a broad sense, we're going to move in this direction, but then be opportunistic about the actual deeks and jukes you have when you're out in the open field, to bring an American football reference to bear.
I always appreciated the Gretzky references in the past. So this is getting into the football field. I will say I love the idea of multiple predictions and multiple outcomes, and the idea of projecting to 2030 and then trying to figure out how we get there. Like what happens over those 10 years that gets us to those multiple outcomes. Holon IQ comes to mind with the way they projected forward. And I know you went to that conference. Yep. And not saying just one outcome, but 5 different possibilities. And here are the positives, here are the negatives, here's how we might get here. I love that frame of mind.
Yeah, there was a great book that I read, Stephen Johnson. Maybe we could try to get him on the show at some point. But he wrote a book called Farsight, which was one of the books that I read this year. It talks all about this. It talks about being a long-term strategic thinker, which is very different from being a good tactician. And ideally, you can do both of those things where, like, when you're in the moment and you need to make a lot of, low stakes, fast decisions, you can do it and not feel frozen by analysis paralysis, which I think with the advent of big data and data science, I think that's increasingly a problem, particularly in management, where, people aren't able to lead or make decisions until they get data, and it winds up slowing everything down. So I think that's an interesting thing on the short-term perspective. But then when you're looking at a longer time horizon, that book, Farsighted, was super interesting. And it talked about, in addition to understanding multiple scenarios, preferably favorable, you want to understand both good, bad, and weird scenarios so that you sort of have the facility in the moment to understand what if things go beautifully according to plan. Like, what if they even exceed expectation? What would I do? And then flip side, what if everything went wrong? What would I do? And then the third range of scenarios is, and then what if something just totally off the radar happened? Which is also why simulations and scenario-based thinking are one of the macro trends that I would see really for the foreseeable future, say the next 10 years, is that thinking about like interactive scenarios, immersive experiences that teach decision makers how to make increasingly complex decisions with just inundation of signals and noise and data, because I think increasingly to make good decisions, you're going to need to be able to filter extra stuff out and then still be able to have that clarity to sort of, and situational awareness to kind of like make fast real-time decisions. All of that to me speaks a little more to mindset training, like, and I think that comes from practice, not the game. It comes from practice, Dan. And everybody's talking about AI.
Yep.
Who's talking about practice? We're talking about practice.
We are each and every time we record. I will also say, I think that the idea you said, strong opinions, lightly held, is the idea. I think something I've learned in doing this show and also just in life is being okay being wrong and learning from it, and having opinions, but also being able to learn from when you're not right with said opinions and on them and keep going. And I think this business, trying to predict out the future, trying to see where trends are going, being able to adjust on the fly and understand new trends or new data points is such a big part of it as well.
Yeah, I agree. And like view that as it's an opportunity to learn. When you're wrong, if you're always right, you're never learning, so the game's over, dude. So like if you're occasionally have a misread, it's like, how much do you confidently assert something when you don't really know?
Right.
That's another problem, so like if you don't actually know what you're talking about, don't assert that you do, which is another challenge I think we all fall prey to. But I think the reality is we're all learning as we go. We're all failing regularly. I just think you don't necessarily want to position it all negatively. Like I think there are opportunities to kind of reframe, how to operate. Cognitive restructuring is what it's called frequently, in behavioral therapy. But there are ways in which you can sort of change your own mindset. Obviously you need to be in a good place to be able to do that, but like hopefully we can start providing more of those types of tools so that people understand how to break out of their ruts and be more flexible in your thought, and be more hopeful and positive and calm as a leader. It's all good stuff. And then we're entering into prediction season, Dan. Like, no joke, we're going to be talking about predictions probably for the next year, right? Like, right. 2020, it's a year to talk about predictions for the next decade. And it's really just starting. It's a super symmetrical year. People are going to be thinking about the future and hovercrafts and robots and brain-computer interfaces, and then we'll all be social and emotional. It's going to be a lot of fun, right? We're looking forward to 2020.
I think you nailed it right there. The year of the prediction, as we look forward to many, many predictions across the year. Lots of research, lots of researchers, lots of teachers and educators and learners on the podcast as well to get their points of view, get new voices on here talking about what is important to them and what they see in the future of learning and education. That's going to do it for this episode. As Mike said, though, stay tuned. Plenty more predictions to come, both of the formal episode but also throughout episodes when we're discussing different topics throughout the year. You'll hear a ton about it. If you have predictions or you have thoughts on 2020 and also 2030 out there 10 years from now, I'd love to hear from you on social media. That's at Trending Ed on Twitter, same on Facebook, linkedin.com/Trending Education. A great place to have conversations around topics such as these. So join us over there. If you're on LinkedIn, we'd love to hear from you. And of course, check out trendingineducation.com. That will be growing and changing over the next few weeks. We look forward to getting more and more content out throughout 2020 on trendingineducation.com. As always, thanks so much for listening to Trending in Education.